What's the most legendary handgun of all time? There are dozens of examples that could come to mind for any firearm.
Shut the fuck up, you damn dirt boy. Colt 1911, best pistol ever made. I don't see you winning two world wars with nothing. We shoot God's 45 caliber out of guns, not you pussy ass power belly. What the fuck is a millimeter? You goddamn Euro
Sorry about that, but yes, the Colt 1911 is possibly the most legendary handgun to ever enter production, and anyone bold enough to claim the contrary is often met with the fabled response of, well, you didn't win 2 world wars, and some form of assertion of American superiority over wherever they're from. But for once I have to admit, the colonials kind of have a point, so today that's what we're going to explore. The legend of the Colt 1911, along with a mandatory explanation of history to squeeze out all the runtime I can out of this topic. Stick around to the end to hear about upcoming projects and how you can be involved in the videos you see on the channel, but now, let me take you back to the late 19th century. Congratulations, it's 1893, and you're a soldier in the prestigious and completely uncontroversial British South Africa Company, and are currently in modern-day Zimbabwe. You're part of a column under the command of Patrick William Forbes, being sent to respond to a previous raid by a native kingdom on your company's totally not stolen resources and wealth. Tonight, your column has set up camp on the Shangani River, but suddenly at 2:15 AM, you're awoken to the sound of an attack. You scramble to your rifle and see a force of some 6,000 men charging towards your column of some 700 British soldiers, and yet, somehow, with a complete numerical disadvantage, as well as being woefully unprepared for a fight, as the sun rose over the battlefield, 1,500 of the natives lay dead, with the rest having retreated, and your column had only lost 4 men. But how? How could this surprise attack have gone so horribly wrong? The answer? The Maxim Gun, of which the British on October 25th, 1893 had just 5 at that camp. The Maxim Gun was the world's first ever fully automatic machine gun, created in 1884 by British-American inventor Hiram Stevens Maxim, and would soon become the backbone of Europe's great scramble to civilize Africa in the waning years of the 19th century. What does this have to do with the 1911, I hear you thinking? And don't worry, I'm getting to it. You see, stories like the Battle of Shangani I just told you demonstrated to the world that the entire landscape of warfare had just irreversibly shifted. Mass-produced automatic weapons were available and literally mowing down rows upon rows of Europe's enemies, which happened to mainly be their colonial subjects, but we don't have to tell anyone that. And the success of Maxim's design kicked off an arms race to duplicate his principles into all sorts of weapons. Everyone and their mother was trying to build semi- and fully automatic weapons based on Maxim's recoil operation, but there would be little in the way of breakthroughs until the 1890s, mainly due to most of these early attempts breaking themselves after a few shots. While the majority of automatic weapons would take much longer to perfect, the first semi-automatic handguns, known as self-loading handguns, would emerge with the Salvatore Dormus pistol in 1891, and was followed by more successful self-loading handguns such as the Borchardt C93 and Mauser C96 within a few short years. Meanwhile, one gun-loving nation was following all this very closely, and would soon characteristically crash ungracefully into the game. The Americans were sitting on the other side of the Atlantic and saw the rapid innovations the Europeans were making and wanted in on it. You see, they had been fighting the Spanish in Cuba and the Filipinos in the Philippines, and had come to the conclusion that their .38 caliber revolvers had about as much potential to stop an attacker as this child trying to tackle a rampaging Boris Johnson, leading to the Thompson-Lagarde ammunition tests. In traditional American fashion, John Taliaferro Thompson, who would later develop the Thompson submachine gun, and Louis Lagarde would line up a bunch of cows outside a slaughterhouse and fire a different range of handgun calibers at them to see which performed best. These tests took place over 2 days, and rightfully concluded that any new handgun design fit for American military service had to fire a .45 caliber bullet or bigger, though the validity of this conclusion is still up for debate, with many calling the tests unscientific, as they really just amounted to Thompson and Lagarde shooting some cows for 2 days in Chicago with little procedure. Nonetheless, the recommendation from the tests was accepted by the Army Ordnance Department, and in 1906 they would publish specifications for the United States' first semi-automatic service handgun. Trials began in 1907, featuring designs from DWM, Webley, Bergman, Savage Arms, and one from Colt, created by the God Emperor of firearms design himself, John Moses Browning. Browning, for those who don't know, before time was time and light existed, Browning roamed the void and birthed the universe from his own no, that's not quite what happened. But if you engage in any discussion about his firearms for long enough, it will inevitably devolve into someone saying something quite similar. However, his reputation even at this time was not unwarranted. Browning had already been responsible for dozens of iconic firearm designs and calibers by this point, producing lever-action rifles for Winchester in the 1880s, semi-automatic handguns for Colt and FN in the 1890s, the .45 ACP cartridge in 1904, and even the legendary M1911 trench gun that the Germans tried to label a war crime in World War I. Colt and Browning submitted to the 1907 trials the short recoil-operated Colt M1905 pistol, an evolution of the Browning-designed Colt M1900 chambered in the new .45 ACP cartridge, and this design showed the most promise, followed closely by offerings from DWM and Savage Arms. After praying at the altar of the so-called father of automatic fire a little bit more, Browning would again descend from the heavens and develop the M1911, which would be put up against the Savage Arms design in a torture test of both handguns once DWM dropped out. Over 2 days, both handguns would fire 6,000 rounds to test their reliability. The Savage design experienced 37 malfunctions. The Colt had none. The Browning pistol would then be formally adopted by the US Army on March 29, 1911, and thus became officially known as the Model of 1911. But what is 1911, and how do 1911, and what do 1911 do? As anyone who has even watched one of my videos can tell you, I'm no engineer, but here's a simple guide to the 1911, presented by me, a historian and an idiot. The 1911 is exactly what the Ordnance Department was looking for, a .45 caliber chambered semi-automatic handgun, feeding from 7-round box magazines, and utilizing a recoil operation similar to Maxim's original design, using the recoil force generated as the bullet moves forward down the barrel to push the slide back, ejecting a casing, rechambering a new round, and readying the handgun for firing. The handgun is also single action, which typically makes accurate shooting easier, and has both a slide and grip safety. And I'm going to leave it at that because I know the square root of jack shit about engineering, and you should definitely go elsewhere for a qualified detailing of how every piece of this gun works. But anyways, this is the handgun that would enter service in 1911, with it first seeing combat in the 1916 Pancho Villa punitive expedition into Mexico, and the US would enter World War I with around 70,000 of the handgun. By November 11, 1918, 515,000 were in service with the US military alone. Even during this early usage by the Americans, the renamed Model 1911 was already gaining a reputation as a deadly, but more importantly dependable handgun, immortalized in the story of Medal of Honor recipient Alvin York, who led 9 other American soldiers in the capture of 132 enemies, famously killing 25 of them himself, including a group of Germans who waited for him to reload his rifle to charge him, only to all be cut down by his Colt 45. The 1911's reputation would be slightly tainted during the First World War, however, due to many reports of the sights being off. But Colt would set about correcting this, developing the Model 1911A1 in 1924, the main improvements being its widened sights and shortened trigger, but would also feature a shortened hammer spur and longer grip safety spur to prevent the hammers of 1911s from biting their users like my cat after I pet her stomach. By 1926, the US military would change the name for Browning's handgun once again, labeling all models produced with a serial number below 700,000 as an M1911, and all models with a serial number above 700,000 as an M1911A1. And that year, John Moses Browning would pass away, leaving this earthly realm to go build another galaxy, or whatever Reddit says His Excellency is supposedly doing beyond the grave. By the time Hitler was hoovering up European nations like a black hole in the late 1930s, the United States would again, as had happened in 1917, be caught with their pants down, and had to start rapidly producing handguns to meet the demands of their military. But after Japan got a little silly at Pearl Harbor, the Americans would begin cranking out 1911s like Russian propagandists producing misinformation about Ukraine. 1.9 million of Browning's handgun would be produced by September 2nd, 1945, and its performance over the course of the war would cement the 1911's legendary status. When the United States entered World War II, the handgun they were supplying their soldiers had become, by virtue of the competition being retired, the largest caliber handgun in service, meaning if an American got into a rough spot, they were fielding the biggest swinging dick they could have to defend themselves as a last resort, which would turn out to be a very, very good thing indeed. Walter Walsh, a former FBI agent and Marine during the war, would find himself and his squad pinned down by a Japanese sniper on the island of Okinawa in 1942, but would manage to eliminate the threat with a single shot fired from his Colt 45 at a distance of nearly 70 meters, or 75 yards for the Yanks in the audience. Owen Baggett, a B-42 pilot, would be shot down over Burma in 1943, and while parachuting to the ground, would draw his 1911 and fire on a passing Japanese aircraft, killing the pilot with a single shot to the head. 2 Americans in the Philippines would be attacked by a machete-wielding native, one of the men shooting him twice in the chest with the 1911's replacement, the M1 carbine, to no effect, while the other would fire one shot from his Colt into the man's head, dropping him instantly. The validity of all of these stories remains, and probably always will be, up in the air, but such tales of the 1911's effectiveness in combat spread like wildfire through the American military, and the Colt 45, now free of its dark mark of supposed inaccuracy thanks to the A1, saw its reputation grow to almost mythical proportions, with many soldiers who technically weren't supposed to be in possession of handguns getting their grubby little mitts on them over the course of the war, with many of these being smuggled back in the duffel bags of returning soldiers. With the fall of the Axis powers by 1945, the 1911 had become the sole handgun to bear a moniker bestowed upon no other handgun before or since, a moniker you no doubt have heard. The handgun that won 2 world wars, which conversely means the just as iconic Luger should be referred to here on out as the handgun that lost 2 world wars. But even before this, the US military was trying to find a replacement for their war-winning weapon. For a design that's over 100 years old, the Colt 1911 is a surprisingly effective handgun, and even with the major advances made in firearms technology since Browning spawned the 1911 into existence and the competition from rival manufacturers, his design remains largely unchanged. The US would attempt to replace the 1911 during the Second World War with the aforementioned M1 carbine, but the general belief among troops due to those stories I mentioned before was that the carbine was underpowered. Even though against soft targets it was effective, but it did lack penetrating power against most cover. Ultimately, the carbine would fail to replace the M1911, which would remain in service well into the Cold War. with a number of variants joining the A1 during this time, as well as the 22 caliber chambered Colt Service Ace, a training pistol version produced since 1931. The Colt Commander, designed in 1949 and produced a year later, was created in response to the US military looking for a lighter pistol to be issued to officers, and features a shortened slide, barrel, and hammer. Originally chambered in 9mm, but would also be chambered for 38 Super and 45 ACP. The M45 MUSOC would be developed in 1986 for the Marine Expeditionary Unit, and features a rounded hammer, ambidextrous thumb safeties, a lighter trigger, improved high visibility sights, match-grade barrels, rubber grips, front cocking serrations, and improved stainless steel magazines. This variant was improved upon with the M45A1 design, having a dual recoil spring system to reduce recoil, along with Picatinny rails for accessories. By this time, however, the Joint Service Small Arms Program had selected the Beretta 92FS as the new M9 service handgun for the US military, and the 1911 would be phased out in the early 1990s. And here is where the debates around the 1911 most often spring up. The Joint Service Small Arms Program demanded a pistol that was chambered in 9mm, a requirement that has enraged a certain section of the firearm enthusiast community since the program began in the 1970s, those that believe in the supremacy of 45 ACP. In all honesty, this isn't a debate I'm qualified to settle, but from what I know, it really comes down to your personal preference. Do you value higher magazine capacity or stopping power? Are you experienced with handling recoil at close ranges? Is it more fun to have eardrums or scream 2 World Wars at anyone who disagrees with you? As the Cold War waned, for the US military at least, 9mm just made more sense, especially as it had been the standard handgun cartridge of all other NATO nations since the 1950s, but America just wanted to be different and cling to its 45 caliber tradition. Today, the 1911 remains in service with the US as the M45, and sees use exclusively with special forces, but its civilian usage remains as high as ever. Civilian ownership of the 1911 boomed in the interwar years, and was so high that there are dozens of reports of American soldiers bringing or being shipped civilian 1911s from home to use in combat during World War II. Colt didn't shy away from using its wartime heritage to advertise the handgun, and after its accuracy issues were resolved in the mid-1920s, the Colt 45 became a staple of competitive shooting. Several civilian models of the 1911 exist, including but not limited to the Colt Government series, the Colt 1991 series, the civilian variant of the aforementioned Colt Commander, and the Colt Gold Cup series, all of which make little in the way of changes to Browning's original design. The 1911 platform is incredibly open to customization. Replacement sights, grips, and other aftermarket accessories are incredibly common, the pistol's versatility leading to it remaining a common sight in competitive shooting to this day. For over 100 years, the Colt 1911 has been the de facto king of the handguns, somehow defying all logic and remaining an effective and battle-ready design, whereas others from the same era are long past their expiration dates. The 1911 is by no means perfect though. Compared to today's handguns, it's heavy, bulky, and produces much more recoil, and firearms design has certainly moved on from the principles that guided the development of the 1911. But as it has proven again and again over its lifetime, if shit hits the fan, it'll still be of use. Before his death, John Moses Browning would produce another batch of legendary firearms, including the M1918 Browning Automatic Rifle, or BAR, the M1919 Browning Machine Gun, the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun and its 50 BMG cartridge, and the Browning High Power. And if you're wondering how this man had any time to be able to die, he didn't. He died at his workbench, working on the early models of the Browning High Power, which would be finished by one of his colleagues in 1935. Until it was replaced, the 1911 would continue saving lives and earning soldiers medals, with Robert Thomas earning the Navy Cross in Vietnam for defending his squad's burning downed helicopter from an onslaught of Viet Cong with his Colt 45 until they were rescued 30 minutes later, reportedly killing between 10 and 30 enemy combatants with his handgun. Though it has fallen out of mainstream service, the groundwork has been laid for the 1911 to make a comeback in the military, with the M1911A2 program in the early 2000s failing to produce a new 45 ACP service pistol, but providing valuable research for what such a pistol would look like should the project be greenlit. Speaking of lit green, the Colt would become an integral part of the chorus of the greatest stoner song ever produced, Afroman's Crazy Rap, which if you haven't heard, go listen to that. I'm so sorry you weren't raised properly. You really can't beat a classic. And if any handgun is deserving of such a label, it's most certainly the Colt 1911. Everywhere America has had an enemy with an ass to kick over the last century, the 1911 has been found right there with them on the front lines. And even with its replacement in the 1980s, some still swear by Browning's iconic handgun design. Love it or loathe it, the M1911 had an undeniable impact on the world, and is a critical part of the military history of the United States, to the point that Utah voted in 2011 to make the Colt 1911 the official firearm of Utah, to honor Browning, who was born and raised there. God bless 45 ACP, and God bless John Moses Browning, the man who created the sun and the moon. Hello, welcome to the unscripted part of the video with me, a very tired Harold. Thank you for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the 1911 in the comments, as well as any other ideas for videos you'd like to see me do. Next week's video, as voted by you all, will be on the myth of Germany's technological superiority in World War II, and you can head over to the community tab on the channel to vote on the video for the week after, which I haven't fully figured out the options for as I'm recording this. Regardless, if you enjoyed, leave a like, and if you're new here, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.